speakers. We have Monty Frank, attorney at Pullman and Comley and the past president of the Connecticut Bar Association. And next we have Rachel Hutchison, senior policy analyst at Fair Vote Connecticut. We have Mark Metzner, associate at Connecticut's Voters for Fairness. And lastly, we have Henry Rowland, associate at Veterans for All Voters. And like I mentioned before, today's action hour, we are discussing ranked choice voting. We are going to hit on about 4 different areas of RCV. We're going to start off with Connecticut's initiative, and then we're going to compare RCV to traditional voting, and then how RCV can help Connecticut, and how it's worked across all of the US. And we will be recording this Zoom, so anyone that isn't here or wants to watch later, you're more than welcome to do so. We'll be uploading it on our YouTube and website. And at the end, we will have time for Q&A. So please feel free at any point during this discussion to leave any questions in the chat, and then I'll be able to go through them and moderate which ones at the end and who I think will be the best person to answer them. And so we can start it off with Monty Frank.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being here. I want to say a special hello to my friend Mayor Bill Finch, who's joined us, and thank you for your leadership, and we're hoping to engage you in leadership on RCV down in your neck of the woods, where I think RCV could make a major impact on Bridgeport politics. Just real briefly, I got involved with ranked choice voting thanks to my good friend, the late Oz Griebel. Oz and I ran for governor, lieutenant governor in 2018. I think in a ranked choice voting scenario, we would have done far better than we did. But Oz was committed to RCV and other electoral reforms following our run. And when he passed away, he handed the baton to me, and with so many friends that are here and leaders across the state and our national partners, we've been working pretty hard to advance ranked choice voting here in Connecticut. I had the privilege of being the vice chair of the governor's working group on ranked choice voting, which I'll talk to you about briefly. We just finished up our work and issued our recommendations to the governor. I'm also pretty heavily involved in Connecticut Voters First, which is a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to advancing electoral reforms here in Connecticut. The 2 things we're focusing on are ranked choice voting, which I'll talk to you today, and another priority, which I think is important for particularly in a state like Connecticut, would be opening up the party primaries to unaffiliated voters. So real briefly, what is ranked choice voting? It's a very simple, common sense, nonpartisan way of fixing the gridlock and division which we see increasingly in our election system. It is simple, it is not complicated. And when I sort of run you through what it is, to the extent you don't know what it is already, I think it will be, the lights will start going on, and you'll start to see, why haven't we done this previously? So RCV is a method of voting that allows voters to rank more than one candidate in order of preference on the ballot: first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, eliminating the need to conduct separate runoff elections to produce a majority winner. So in our system today, a plurality is required in order to win a race. Ranked choice voting ensures that whoever emerges from a ranked choice voting election has the majority of the electorate in support. So on the first ballot, if a candidate receives more than half of the first choices, that candidate wins, just as in the current pick one, pass the goalpost elections. If there is no majority winner after counting first votes, the race is decided by instant runoff. The candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who pick that losing candidate will have their votes counted for their next choice. The process of eliminating losing candidates continues until 2 candidates remain and the majority candidate wins. When I show you a ballot, let's see if I can share my screen. I think you'll see how easy it is, and just give you a better sense of how widespread ranked choice voting is in the country and in the world. Here in the United States, 14 million voters in 29 red and blue states have used RCV. It was used in New York City primary. It's been used in San Francisco forever. And it's being adopted in Washington, D.C. and other places. So if I share my, let me find the ballot and then let me share my screen. All right. So this is from the Connecticut Voters First website, which is ctvotersfirst.org. And you'll see on the screen, sort of crooked, the Alaska Democratic primary ballot from 2020. And you'll see, if you recall, that was a fairly crowded field. Joe Biden, Tom Steyer, Bernie Sanders, and Amy Klobuchar, Tulsi Gabbard, who was Democrat back then, Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bloomberg, and Pete Buttigieg. And so when you go into the ballot box, it's as simple as like you're going to the grocery store or going to a restaurant and looking at a buffet. You fill out what your first, check, third, fourth, and fifth choice by just filling in the box. So let's say you had Tom Steyer as your first choice, and and nobody got 50%. If Tom Steyer had the least number of votes, your first choice is eliminated. And then your second choice, so let's say your second choice was Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders would then get your vote, and this process just would continue until one candidate has 50%. As you can see, pretty easy. The exit polls from New York City and other places that have looked to voters to gauge their experience. The numbers are overwhelmingly in support of ranked choice voting. It is not confusing. Most voters like it, and it has continued in almost every jurisdiction that has tried it. So let me stop sharing my screen. So just give you a little bit of history of where we've been in Connecticut. In the last legislative session, Kathy Austin, who is Senator Chair of Appropriations on the Democratic side, and Tony Huang, who is at that point was the deputy minority leader in the Senate, came together in a bipartisan way to propose a bipartisan bill to advance ranked choice voting in 3 areas. One was to use ranked choice voting in presidential preference primaries, similar to the ballot I just showed you from Alaska. The second would be to allow parties, if they so choose, to use ranked choice voting. Again, it was an enabling option rather than a mandate. And the third area would be to allow municipalities, if they wanted to use ranked choice voting, to use it. So just sort of breaking down each of those options, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will go into more detail about it. The bill was focused on those 3 areas because, one, it did not require a constitutional amendment. Arguably, it might if there was, if we were to try to use it on a statewide basis, similar to the referendum we've had recently for no excuse absentee ballot and early voting. The second area, opening up party primaries or allowing parties to use ranked choice voting. I do want to open up party primaries, but let's focus on RCV for today. It's simply a tweak in the legislation that would allow political parties, if they wanted to use ranked choice voting, to use it. And again, it wasn't a mandate, it was an option for the parties. The experience of other parties using ranked choice voting has been incredibly positive. New York City had rolled out ranked choice voting in the last Democratic primary for mayor and common council. Voters loved it. It had pretty amazing results, particularly when you looked at the common council. So that's on the Democratic side. We had a presentation in front of the working group from Crick Saxman, who organized using ranked choice voting in Virginia for the GOP. And literally the title of his PowerPoint presentation was how ranked choice voting saved the Virginia GOP. They had been losing elections over and over again because they were putting up candidates who were pretty far to the right, and they couldn't get close to the middle, and so they lose the general. The ranked choice voting, they put up a moderate candidate for governor who then won, and won not only with support of the electorate, but because of the ranked choice voting process, he came out of the primaries with a consensus of the Republicans around him who are then willing to work to help him get elected. The bill that had been presented also had a municipal option. So in Connecticut, if a municipality wants to use ranked choice voting, despite the fact that we're a home rule state, they're not allowed to do that because the powers come from the legislature, and the legislature has not authorized them to make that choice for themselves. You know, I often like to compare that to Massachusetts. So if you recall, recently ranked choice voting failed in a statewide referendum in Massachusetts by a very slim amount. However, municipalities have been allowed to use ranked choice voting and have been using ranked choice voting in Massachusetts for a very long time. Cambridge is one city of note. They've been using ranked choice voting for over 50 years. And so the argument is, well, if Cambridge can use it despite the fact that it failed referendum in Massachusetts, why couldn't that same logic apply here in neighboring Connecticut, where there are municipalities that we believe want to use ranked choice voting if they were given the option to do it, and all it requires is the legislature to say, yeah, Hartford or Bridgeport or some of the smaller towns, if you want to use ranked choice voting in certain races, you can do so. Following the last session, where the ranked choice voting bill did not make it to the floor of the legislature for a vote, the governor, who is committed to ranked choice voting and supports it and has been a partner in our effort, put together the working group. Senator Austin and Senator Wong were the co-chairs. I served as the vice chair. We started our work in August. We just finished up. We heard from experts from around the country, not only on what ranked choice voting is and what the advantages are, but also how it's been implemented. What are the nuts and bolts? What are the key factors that need to be in place for a successful rollout of ranked choice voting? We also heard from those like Chris Saxman I talked about, who have implemented through the political process, through parties, ranked choice voting in various places, as well as election administrators, the Maine Secretary of State, Josh Elliott, who ran ranked choice voting in Utah, and particularly in Salt Lake City, where ranked choice voting has been used very successfully for municipal races. And again, I'm pointing out jurisdictions and places where ranked choice voting has been used regardless of political affiliation. They're used in very red states and very blue states and everything in between. And again, it's all about engaging the electorate and getting a result where the candidate who emerges has a majority of support of the people. The working group's recommendations sort of line up with where Senator Huang and Kathy Austin were in the last bill. It's to give municipalities the option to decide to use RCV in certain municipal races, to give political parties the option, but not the mandate, to use ranked choice voting in party conventions and primaries, and give the political parties the option, but not a mandate, to use or not use the RCV tabulation processes in their presidential preference primaries for purposes of determining how to allocate delegates to national conventions. There are some off ramps for the Secretary of State. We made very clear that in pushing ranked choice voting forward, we do not want to impact fusion voting in Connecticut or the clean election program. And we also stress the importance of robust civic education generally, and particularly with the rollout of RCV. My argument on that to the working group was, putting ranked choice voting aside, it's about time that Connecticut made civic education and education around elections, voter education, voter turnout drives, a priority, and that we robustly fund civic education, voter education. And that would include both the electorate as well as making sure that the registrars and the secretary and the town clerks are properly informed as to how to roll this important electoral reform forward. And then I just want to talk very briefly about next steps and then turn it over to my colleagues. Connecticut Voters First intends to very actively push for the implementation of the working group's recommendations in the next legislative session. We are working with the governor's office, and we expect the governor to put in a governor's bill on ranked choice voting. And if not, or in addition to, certainly we are working hard to have a bipartisan bill come forth from legislators. Over the last summer, we've been meeting with legislatures, and both from the Republican side and Democratic side, on building a broad coalition of support on ranked choice voting. So that's sort of our under the dome strategy. And then we've engaged consultants to help us build the coalition outside the Gold Dome so that we can make sure that there's popular support and a drive in municipalities and local communities to push legislatures to allow the bill to move forward. We hope that it'll come out of committee. We expect it will. And then there'll be the push in the legislature to get that passed. I know that's a lot of material. Hopefully we'll have a little time for a Q&A afterwards. And I think, Henry, you're next on this?
Yeah. Henry can really talk a little bit about, so Monty just gave the perspective of where we're at, how this moved forward through the legislature, that it's for real, the governor's on board, et cetera. But Henry, you can bring a little bit more of like the citizens' perspective, like why do we really care, right? And then I'll touch on the environmental stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And Monty, thank you very much for that excellent background and description of what it is. And one of the things I want to talk about is why it's superior to what we currently do. And one of the things I like to point to is the 116th Congress right now has an approval rating, or the past session, of like 15%. But the re-election rate was like 95%. And the only way those two numbers can exist together is if the structures around how we elect and hold accountable our leaders, it just doesn't work, right? So these structural changes that Monty just explained, they change a lot of behaviors for those individuals that we will be electing. It changes the incentives. And I want to explain sort of how it changes the incentives. The four, I would say 3 to 4 major groups of participants in our politics are voters, obviously, candidates, public officials who have been elected, and then those, I would say, are pre-candidates, people that have not been elected. Maybe they don't want to even get involved in politics because they know they would have to participate in a system that doesn't incentivize behavior that leads to good governance. You have to sort of play to the base first and then move as much as you can to the middle to actually get something done. But for voters, right, we have sometimes single-digit percentages of voters participating in the primaries, and I echo Monty's desire to open those primaries because that would change that dynamic. But for now, we have candidates who have to appeal to those single-digit percentages of voters, and once they do, whoever is on the ballot is sort of the menu that the rest of the general population is stuck with, and they have no real incentive to do anything other than pick A or B or abstain. And that's a big problem in our politics. The fact that we have a system that creates an environment where only two choices are really the main options makes every issue in our politics a binary issue when really no issues are binary, right? So that's a couple incentives that we need to change. And the way to do that is to create a meaningful process to have more than two candidates on the ballot, right? So they're not spoilers. And you guys hear the spoiler argument all the time. If you have three candidates, one's Democrat, one's Republican, one's a third party, the common concern is that if you vote for that third party, you're wasting your vote, right? It's going to take votes away from someone that you might not support. You have to vote strategically. You can't vote for your true preference. And these preferential systems like ranked choice voting or approval voting or other systems, it gets rid of that, right? It better connects that candidate to the people who voted for him or her. Now, once that candidate is elected, now their incentives change again. They don't now have to worry about being primary to do their job. They don't have to worry about only appealing to their party's base or their party's platform to do their job. They now have a more incentive to actually reach out and collaborate with everyone that they're supposed to be working with anyway, regardless of political party, to solve real problems. And I'm sure Mark will talk about real problems that need to be solved in the environmental space. But right now we're arguing about whether, say, climate change is real. We're not even talking about how to solve problems or solving, we're talking about whether the problem exists. And the reason why that is our discussion is because when everything is binary, you don't have two parties coming together solving problems. You have two parties saying, well, I just disagree with everything, even the existence of the problem, if one party is trying to solve it. So those incentives change at the public official level. And then for those who would want to get involved with politics but don't want to touch it because of the current system, you may get a much broader and more diverse candidate pool when these structural changes happen. And we've seen that in many jurisdictions that have implemented these systems. The candidate pool is much more diverse, and it adds to the competitiveness of the whole system. And competitiveness right now is sorely lacking in our politics. And as we all know, competitiveness produces results, right? You want competition because that brings good ideas, that brings fresh ideas. And the lack of competition in our politics is why a lot of us categorize our current system as a duopoly. And you'll see a lot of very, very smart people talk about this on the political science side, how it's such a toxic environment, because again, when you have a duopoly controlling everything, including the rules of elections, you don't have any space for any new ideas. And that's a big problem. So again, we could talk about climate change, we could talk about veterans issues, we talk about anything that's important in this world. It's not going to get solved if you have a duopoly in charge of solving those problems, right? The big thing that I also want to point out is you encourage, with these types of elections, you encourage more civil and positive campaigns. And that sounds like something that's not too meaningful, but as I think everyone can agree, today's environment is so negative. We want to have candidates in front of us who don't just talk about how bad the other side is or how bad the other person is or how or just about their differences, right? We want candidates in front of us who will admit, hey, I agree with X, Y, and Z on the other side. I can work with the other side because they're looking for that second choice, that second place on that ranked ballot. So even though it seems to be a technical change, it really does change the temperature of campaigns, right? Because you're not just convincing everybody that the world is going to fall apart if the other party is in control of our government. You're telling everybody everything's going to be fine. In fact, I agree with my counterpart on X, Y, and Z. And not only is that refreshing, but it's productive because all of those elections that occur with these preferential systems, it tells whoever got elected what's really important to the base, not to the base, to the majority of voters. Right now, if you do have, say, a way to have a third or even fourth candidate on the ballot, but you maintain the plurality system, then that means that you only need, 25% or 35% of the votes to win. So 75% of the people didn't want you, and you don't know what they want, right? But with these systems, you know what people want because of how they participated in those elections. So, I mean, there are so many benefits, but again, once you increase competitiveness, I think that's one of the biggest benefits. And if you're like us, looking at this, it's not about the people in office. There are plenty of great people in office. They're not incentivized to behave in a productive way. It's the system that's working against the people in office, right? So it's not about electing moderates, and ranked choice voting doesn't even change who becomes our public officials. It just changes their behavior. And that's what we really want. A system where you can have, a mediocre candidate in a great system will produce results. Right now, we can have rock star candidates in a dysfunctional system, and they're going to get beat down, and they're going to get primaried, and we're not going to get anywhere. So that's the basic gist of sort of why it's better. And I know we have, I'd love to jump in when Mark's talking about climate change, because we're going in the opposite direction in a lot of things in this country, simply because of the way our public officials are held accountable. I mean, I don't know if there's any other more simple explanation, right? They're not held accountable to what the problems that they really face are. They're not held accountable to solve problems. The way that they are successful as politicians, the big they, is how zealously they can defeat the other side. And once you do that, you've succeeded in this current environment. But you don't have to solve a problem. You just have to you just have to stop the other side from succeeding, and then you succeed. And that's not a healthy way to participate in politics.
Yeah, that's a great perspective to complement the way Monty described. Monty gave us the kind of the roadmap of how this is unfolding, and this is for real, and the governor's behind it, and we've got the working group. And then Henry, that's a fantastic perspective on kind of like, why did politicians act in these ways? If we all want a clean environment, if we all want great education system, good transportation, blah, 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 why is it so hard for these guys to come together? And in particular, why are we also motivated in Connecticut Voters First and all these associated organizations that work with us? Why does everybody care in Connecticut? Well, Connecticut has tremendous problems. One big bucket of problems is around our cities. We've got, we're one of the richest states. We have some of the poorest cities, and it's a huge waste of human capital. It's a huge waste of industrial capital. We also have a lot of, in some ways, on the environmental conservation side, we have a lot of great successes, but we have a lot of issues that are stalled, that are very popular. And as Henry says, they're stalled because of the structure of the legislature, how people get rewarded for not working together and grandstanding and scaring each other on costs. And so let me put up a slide to kind of bring this to life, where the environmental issues and the city issues kind of overlap. Can you guys see that? Henry, can you see that slide? All right, awesome. So Monty was talking before, and Henry too, about, what are the things on the left that ranked choice voting brings to the game, and how does it change the incentives? And then what I just did is on the right, looked a little bit on, thought about the conservation environmental issues that are out there in Connecticut. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you see some of this stuff that is I would say, very broadly popular that is stalled, that can't get through this legislature. And, we're talking about PFAS, we're talking about nicotinoid, pesticides, emission standards. Henry, forget about climate change broadly. We're just talking about specific stuff about like, hey, there's a lot of EV owners in the state and they can't even get the state to rally behind enough charging stations, et cetera. So, in addition to, so we think about this, so what does this mean to the League of Conservation voters? If ranked choice voting were to pass, how would this change? So the ways to think about it are, what are the obstacles to essentially a group of popular issues that are not getting addressed by politicians today? Well, one issue is politicians really don't reach out on these issues that much because they don't need to. As Henry said, you're either a Dem or Republican, you got to vote with your tribe and that's it. So they don't really need to bring it up. Secondly, not that many, there aren't third party candidates. There aren't Green Party candidates running around highlighting these issues and saying, hey, PFAS stuff, hey, car charging, hey, climate change, emission stuff. We got to make this front and central. And part of the reason is they're afraid to be spoilers. They don't want to take votes away from the Dem side. Maybe that's regarded as more sympathetic. And then, why do the Republicans feel that it's such a winning strategy to gaslight every one of these issues on costs? Oh God, if we do PFAS stuff, it's gonna be so costly. Oh, if we do charging stuff, it's gonna be so costly, it's gonna bankrupt the state. When you probably get them offline over a beer and you realize they'll admit that no, it's really not gonna bust the budget. In fact, it's gonna pay for itself. And they all admit, everybody these days is talking about our future energy grid needs in this state and how renewables need to be a part of it, but yet we're stuck in these pointless debates, screaming about who's at fault for rate hikes instead of working together to solve it. So look at the stuff on the right. This is where we kind of try to say, look, on practical terms, what would happen? Well, on the left, it says in ranked choice voting, you need 50% to win. You can't win with a plurality. And this would be true in primaries, and this would be true in generals and general elections. So knowing that, everybody's going to be reaching out to get all the voters they can. They need to get to that 50%. You can't win with 23%. Joe Ganim wins with 23%. That's one of the reasons our bill is targeting at the cities in Connecticut, is they're held up by these old-fashioned machine politics. There's no room for environmental issues in that calculation of how machine politics works, right? The way they work is they get their 23% of devoted followers to the Dem primary. They win the plurality, and the Dems are going to then win the election for the mayor spot in the big cities. And environmental issues are not going to feature at all. Now, if they had to get to 50%, they'd have to reach out to environmentally savvy voters, and these issues would be front and center. And secondly, in the second item, suddenly now, as the way Monty described it, you rank your choices. So that means people need the second and third choice votes. In order to get to the 50%, I can't get there on my first choice votes. I got to get the voters who voted for somebody else first, and they're going to give me their second choice. That's how I'm going to get there. That opens the door for other candidates can run, because they can go out there and they can say, hey, give me your vote for the Green candidate. And guess what? You're not taking a vote away from the Democratic candidate, because yeah, I'm probably going to finish last, but I'm going to get 10, 15%. I'm going to have all this clout. They're going to have to respect our environmental issues in order to get our second choice votes. Now we've got some visible clout. Now we've got some leverage. So there'll be more Green candidates that'll be able to run. Third, as we said before, there'll be much less of an incentive for Republicans to grandstand and gaslight around costs and other reasons for going against some of this pretty common sense environmental legislation and conservation legislation. They need the second choice votes, so they want to reach out. And the reward is going to be for them being win-win. That's they're going to be able to go back and brag to the voters. They're going to say, look, I worked with the other side. I got a deal on PFAS regulation here, and it's going to benefit all of us, and it didn't bust the budget. And then if you look at the fourth one down, we talked about there'd be more candidates with ranked choice voting focusing on environmental issues, but there'd also be more voters. The voters would now, today, I think Henry might have mentioned this, but turnout of our young voters and our independents is awful, and especially in our cities. In Bridgeport, I think in the mayoral election, it was about 5% turnout. And so you have 15,000 people voting totally, deciding the fate of our biggest cities, each one, with so few votes. So when green voters, conservation voters now are a target, and you have to get those voters to win because you have to get to 50%. You need their second choices. Now the voters get encouraged, and they're like, hey, candidates are calling on us. Green candidates are calling us and highlighting our issues, but even other candidates, Republicans, the Gannums of the world, as Henry said, the same people, now they have different incentives. They're reaching across and saying, hey, we're going to do this remediation on the Bridgeport waterfront that we've been stalling on for 30 years. Hey, we're going to get to these ground pollutants. Hey, we're going to deal with this emission control stuff. So the voters are going to see that. They're going to come out, and now suddenly we're going to have a much bigger role for what I call conservation environmental C&E voters. And then the last thing is, as a result of all this stuff, and primarily as you see on the left, because look, the whole thing is about compromise. It's about getting politicians, giving them the reward for compromising, working together. So that's going to move these issues forward. And so as far as the conservation agenda is concerned, this is a pretty solid, practical approach for helping drive that forward. And then the last point I'll make before I hand it off to Rachel is everything that we've just talked about with respect to how ranked choice voting will help drive environmental and conservation priorities also applies to economic development in our cities. Back to the point about our cities being disaster areas. Yeah, they're environmental disaster areas with lead paint and ground pollutants and everything else and all this neglected industrial capacity. But they're also an economic disaster for Connecticut. And the degree to which Connecticut can take advantage of our cities and the industrial capacity we have there, the human capital. One of the biggest issues facing the business community in Connecticut right now is a labor shortage. And we've got all kinds of human capital that's being wasted in our cities today. And we've got actually good vocational infrastructure in Connecticut and obviously great educational institutions that can all be put together into some huge win-win solutions. And, Jim Himes has been driving the Green Bank. There could be a green tech boom in Connecticut. It could help revitalize our cities and so on. So there's kind of these two parallel paths. Ranked choice voting is going to be really good for the conservation agenda. It's also going to be really good for our cities. And those two things overlap. Our cities are environmental disasters. They need help. And from a social justice point of view, that's the right thing to do. And that's good for the state, but it's also good from an economic development point of view. So there's a lot of really good practical reasons why this is going to make a big difference. And as Monty said, we're starting out very realistically. This bill gives cities and towns the option. It doesn't mandate, it's not going to provoke a wave of resistance. It's just going to let them have their own debate. So Bridgeport could have its debate, Hartford, Norwalk, Stonington. We've got a bunch of towns and cities that are already interested, but I think it's super exciting for Connecticut and goes along with our whole commitment to home rule in Connecticut and to the land of steady habits. So that being said, let me hand off to Rachel and take this slide down, and Rachel can give us a little perspective on how this has worked out in other cities and across the country, and how realistic is this that we're talking about.
Just real quick, Mark, before we hand it off to Rachel, to your last couple points. So one thing that I think folks might not know, in Connecticut, the largest group of registered voters is unaffiliated. And I'm one of those. I've never been affiliated with a political party, but I don't have a meaningful voice in our politics. And similarly, our politicians don't know what I care about because of the way our systems are structured. And to your last point, with green competitiveness, let's say that, we saw this play out in Europe, where they were slow to adopt sort of the green, so their green rivals, right, came in, like China, and dominated the electric vehicle market.
Yeah.
Because their politics was too slow to catch up to what the rest of the world was doing. And China saw an opportunity, they jumped in. So bring that down to Connecticut and the manufacturing level, we could be missing a lot of opportunities to lead the way because our politics are stuck and not allowing that competitiveness. But yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick. Thank you, Rachel, for giving me a couple minutes, and I'm really excited to hear your portion of this too.
Yeah, of course. Very cool to be on this panel with all of you. Hey, everybody, I'm Rachel Hutchinson. I'm a senior policy analyst at FairVote. We are a national organization that researches and advocates for ranked choice voting across the country. So my job is basically to analyze and research and then communicate how ranked choice voting is actually working in practice. And the cool thing about Connecticut studying and considering ranked choice voting in 2024 is that it's no longer some unique novel idea that your cities would just be taking a chance on. There's actually a lot of jurisdictions that use it, and therefore we have a pretty good idea of how it actually works in practice. So I'm just going to share some slides about what we know so far. Cool, and I'll just do this. Everybody can see this? Awesome, thank you. So here I just have a map of where ranked choice voting is currently used in the country. As you can see, it's used in a bunch of different contexts, states, cities, counties, but altogether there's 51 American jurisdictions that are using ranked choice voting right now, home to nearly 14 million voters. So there are a lot of voters across the country who are already familiarized, socialized with the concept and using ranked ballots. Just to give a few different examples of how it's used statewide. Maine and Alaska use it to elect their representatives, their senators, even president. There are municipalities that are using it to elect their city councilors, their mayors, and then there are a bunch of places where it's used within party primaries to nominate candidates. So there were 5 state Democratic parties that used it in 2020, the Virginia GOP, as Monty mentioned at the beginning, has used it to nominate some of their gubernatorial and congressional candidates. So a lot of different use cases, ways it can be used. And then to get into sort of what we know about how it's used in practice, one most universal finding is that voters like it and they understand it. In every jurisdiction it's used. The exit polls pretty much universally confirm this. So just to give some highlights, Alaska, when they used it for the first time, 85% of voters reported it was simple. In New York, when they used it for the first time, 95% said the same thing, and 77% said they support using it in future elections. Portland, Oregon voters just used it for the very first time this November, and 91% said they understood how to fill out their ranked choice voting ballot. And when the Virginia GOP primary voters used it, some of them used it in their congressional primary and some of them didn't. That was sort of a choice of each local party. But a majority of those who lived in the jurisdictions that did use it said that they preferred it to single choice voting. Another thing we know based on the research is that voters in these jurisdictions are actually utilizing the ranked ballot and ranking multiple candidates when given the opportunity. Specifically, a median of 68% of voters are ranking 2 or more candidates in these contests. So I think it shows that voters understand it, they're buying in, they're taking advantage of the opportunity. We also know that ranked choice voting makes an average of 17% more ballots count in the final outcome. So what I'm referencing here is people who voted for maybe a less viable candidate as their first choice, but were still able to weigh in between frontrunners with their backup choice and therefore have their vote count in a more meaningful way than it otherwise would have. We also know that ranked choice voting promotes campaign civility, as mentioned earlier. So there's a bunch of published journal articles out there that show things like that in ranked choice voting contests, candidates are more likely to engage with each other, media coverage is more positive, voters are more satisfied with the conduct of campaigns. And we have a nice quote from Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski here, who has run in a ranked choice voting election back in 2022, that sort of explains the mechanism behind this, which is that she says, we like the fact that candidates were perhaps more civil. When I knew I needed to get an opponent's second place votes, I'm not going to trash talk her in our debates or public encounters because I want to pick up some of that support. Something else unique that we've seen to ranked choice voting is pairs of candidates running for the same seat or set of seats actually teaming up and going on the campaign trail together and releasing advertisements together saying, hey, rank us first and second. We have more in common than we disagree on. And so I've put some examples of people doing that up here. We can see advertisements from San Francisco, from Oakland, from Portland, from New York. We see candidates. I have a little clip from Instagram here making a video together of here are the things we agree on and here's how you should consider ranking us. So this is pretty unique compared to the toxic politics that we see in most jurisdictions today. Ranked choice voting has also been shown to increase representation, and the mechanism at play here is that a lot of times I think candidates who are young, diverse, upstart, maybe don't have a lot of money, are told to sort of wait their turn, or else they're going to be wasting people's votes. They are going to be splitting votes within their ideological or demographic community. Whereas with ranked choice voting, that's no longer a problem. People can run without doing that sort of spoiler effect thing. And so how we've seen this in practice is that Minneapolis, St. Paul, Salt Lake City have elected their first majority people of color city councils. We've seen New York City and Las Cruces elect their first majority female city councils. Portland, Oregon, again, they just used it for the first time to elect their city council, and they have a historically diverse and gender balanced council for the first time. Good quote here from Diane Morales, who ran in New York City to be mayor a few years ago under ranked choice, who sort of explains this from her perspective. She said, candidates like me, outsiders, first-timers, women of color are often overlooked. Words like viability and electability serve as gatekeepers. And that ranked choice voting, on the other hand, has the potential to give voters real option and level the playing field. Another really great thing ranked choice voting does is identify consensus candidates, as we talked about a little bit. So in US RCV elections, and we have a database of probably 700 to 800 of them that have happened in the last 20 years. Interestingly, 75% of ballots rank a winning candidate in their top 3. So this means that the supermajority of voters who participate in this elections are seeing a candidate of their choice. They do feel represented by their counselor, mayor, representative, whoever. If not by their first choice, they are invested in that candidate through their second or third choice. There's also good incentives for bipartisanship, as we've talked about earlier. So interestingly, Alaska uses ranked choice voting to elect their state legislatures. They did so in 2022 and in 2024. And following both of these elections, bipartisan governing coalitions formed in both the state House and the state Senate, which is pretty unique. I don't think we see this in any other state legislature, really. And back to the Virginia GOP example, so the candidates who emerged from ranked choice voting primaries versus those who emerged from single choice primaries had higher net favorability. So kind of proving the concept that when you use ranked choice voting in a party primary, it's going to produce stronger nominees who have the consensus of their party, and the party can kind of put its best foot forward for November. So at this point, I hope sort of the effects of ranked choice voting are kind of coming clear, but maybe you might be wondering, how do we actually go about implementing this? What's it going to cost us? And the answer to that latter question is that most modern voting equipment from the major US manufacturers is already RCV compatible. So if there are any technological equipment costs that come with your jurisdiction adopting ranked choice voting, it's really just to update old machines that are due for an upgrade anyways. Sort of the main cost is more like on the voter education side. Another interesting thing is that the majority of ranked choice voting jurisdictions release ranked choice voting results the night of or after the election. So this includes cities in Utah, California, Minnesota. This is because ranked choice voting can just be tabulated with the click of a button pretty instantly. I have a newspaper clipping from Boulder, Colorado, which uses ranked choice voting on the right here. This is from a couple days after election day last year, where they had their council elections. And you can see in the middle section, the mayor who was elected via ranked choice voting was determined, I don't know, a day or two after the election, whereas there was a city council race that didn't use ranked choice voting because there were only 2 candidates. This is the headline at the top, and they still don't know who won that race. So it's not really about whether you use ranked choice voting or not that tells you how fast the results are coming in. It's just kind of like how close is the result, like any other election. So yeah, that's sort of the overview of what we've seen so far with it. And I'm happy to take any questions.
If I could just jump in, I just want to highlight some of the points that have been made and just make a couple others. One, and Rachel, you maybe expand on this because I know you've written articles about zombie voting. But here in Connecticut, we were sort of late in the game on early voting and no excuse absentee ballots, which are 2 reforms that I know a lot of people on this Zoom advocated for and supported. But and I support it as well. I think they're both valuable reforms that we've instituted here. But in doing so, you've sort of created a problem that ranked choice voting fixes. So the more people who vote early, or the more people who vote by no excuse absentee ballots, or just our military who live in, who are voting in Connecticut but are stationed overseas, or in Pensacola, Florida, for example, where my son-in-law is stationed in the Navy, they have no choice but to vote early. And when you have a crowded primary field, particularly in presidential preference primaries, the likelihood of their number one choice dropping out is not that small. And I know, Rachel, you wrote an article about Super Tuesday this past cycle, and that 269,000 Republicans were effectively disenfranchised because their candidate who they voted for dropped out. When you look at what happened in the 2020 primaries on the Democratic side, I think it was close to 3 million Americans who lost their vote because by the time the primary day came around in their state, the candidate had already dropped out. And so this is an important reform that sort of needs to go hand in glove with the important reforms we've already instituted. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Rachel.
No, you got that exactly right. Yeah, it was 3 million people that happened to in 2020 in the Democratic presidential primaries. And I think it was 300,000 Republicans that happened to this time around. Obviously, the more competitive the race is, the more it's going to happen. So that's why it was bigger in the 2020 race. But yeah, definitely ranked choice voting lets you just vote your conscience and not have to worry, oh no, is my favorite candidate going to drop out? Should I not vote early? So that's another really great use case.
Yeah, it's a backup choice, right? So if you go to the buffet and you really wanted steak, and by the time you get to the buffet, there's no more steak left, well, then, your second choice is chicken, and there may be chicken there. And that's
So Rachel, maybe you want to answer this question, right? Because it's a little bit of a technical question. Randy says, imagine there'd be more invalid ballots with ranked choice voting. Are voters allowed to fix their ballot if they mistakenly pick two third choice candidates, let's say, or does the machine kick it out automatically? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. So there are several academic articles that have looked into this, and they generally find that ballot error rates are pretty much similar between single choice voting and ranked choice voting. If you do an error on a machine in person, it will kick it back to you and you'll have the opportunity to do it again. There are other jurisdictions, like New York, for example, that have like a ballot curing process. So if you fill out an error, the New York Board of Elections will let you know and give you a chance to fix it and send back another one. So those are sort of some ways that error can be adjusted, but overall, it happens at a similar rate to just any other system.
I have a question, Liliana. I don't know if it works this way, but I have a question for your members who are on. So, we've talked about ranked choice voting, the legislation that's pending, how this could improve elections generally and in Connecticut, and specifically to environmental items that are on the League of Conservation Voter agenda, right? The things are on PFAS and charging and emissions and other things. Do people are they thinking about the environmental issues that you guys support and they're looking for more cooperation from legislators? Does this sound like it would be productive and helpful to have both parties actually working together on this stuff as opposed to like grandstanding on it? Love to hear your guys' perspective on that.
I mean, I would think so. Anyone feel free in chat to, I guess, reply to that and really answer what Mark was asking. We do also have some questions. One of them is from Jenny, and it is absentee ballot slow down counting of ballots. Does RCV deal with that? Again, I think this may be for Rachel for a more logistic side.
Yeah, that's a really fair question. So it's sort of a separate issue. Each board of elections makes their own decision about when their absentee ballots are going to be due in. So, New York, when they used it for the first time, they decided it's COVID, we're going to allow 3 weeks. And other places like Alaska, it's more rural, so they're going to allow for more time too. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the nature of ranked choice voting because, once you have all the ballots, you can tabulate it in a second. So it's more of a separate decision. That's why in a lot of cities, we see them doing it the night of or the next day because it's not as rural or not as much time to just collect all the ballots. So sort of a separate question, but a good one.
Okay. If I could just jump in for 1 second, just to highlight some of the points that have been made. During the course of the working group, we heard from a number of candidates who had run in a ranked choice voting environment and won. And the two things that really stuck out in my mind, and I think resonated with the working group, were one, that it really has driven more diverse voices on city councils. Again, the Minneapolis experience, the New York City experience, the Portland, Maine experience, where because of folks not having to wait their turn to run, people have jumped in without having to fear vote splitting or begging the party elites to let them run. They can just run, and as a result, more candidates did run, more women and people of color have gotten elected. The New York City Council is a perfect example where that council flipped, where people of color and women had a very small voice on the city council and now represent a majority. The third thing that, and Mark touched on it, is candidate behavior and voter reactions to it. Every single candidate who came before us told a version of this story, whether it be door knocking or going to campaign events. If you're door knocking and you see somebody with a lawn sign for your opponent, in the typical scenario in Connecticut, you just walk past that door and go to the next one. But in a ranked choice voting scenario, you knock on that door. And when the door answers, you say, hey, look, I saw from your lawn sign that you're supporting my opponent, and that's fine. I agree with that candidate on the following things, whether it's environmental or gun violence prevention, or whatever issue it may be on the left or the right. But I agree with that candidate, and I hope that you will support me and put me down as your number 2 choice, because our positions are aligned. I mean, think about that. I mean, that you talk about playing nice in the sandbox and just changing the whole dynamics of how we campaign and what we reward. And that's what we're driving for here in Connecticut. And that's why this could be such a tremendous game changer for the politics in our state.
Awesome. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I do, however, have one more actually from Scott. Is you mentioned the NYC City Council, but is there any evidence that people elected by RCV are better at their jobs? Oh, I think you're muted, Mark.
Give a quick answer, and then Rachel, you can, I think you probably have a richer answer, but I do know from some of our colleagues who are in Alaska, and they've been giving us regular updates on how ranked choice voting has been working in Alaska. And they say that the legislature is the most productive in 50 years, that they've got these bipartisan caucuses, one for education, one for transportation, one for environmental, et cetera. And they never had those in the past. So they get together and they've actually excluded some significant, very extreme kind of voices that were disruptive. So it said, hey, if you can't be in the bipartisan kind of culture that we're creating in these caucuses, you'll have to be outside of this caucus, and you can obviously vote, but you can't caucus with us. And these are bipartisan. So that's super exciting. Anyway, Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, so far on this question, it's just sort of a lot of anecdotal evidence. So Mark did a great job outlining what's happening in Alaska. I know in New York City, when they elected their first ever majority female council, there's an organization called Represent Women, and they did a really great report about how they've made a lot of progress on women's issues since that happened. The representatives to Congress who have been elected via ranked choice voting are some of the most bipartisan moderate ones in the whole House. So that includes like Lisa Murkowski and Senator Susan Collins. It includes Representatives Jared Golden and Mary Peltola. And they've consistently been ranked among the most productive and bipartisan members too. Not to say that ranked choice voting only elects moderates, but just sort of the person who's right for the jurisdictions, and those happen to be right for those jurisdictions. So there's definitely some anecdotal evidence. It's something Fairvote is looking to look into more in this year.
If I can add too, I mean, it's just logical when you have a candidate who wins and is now in office, who is better informed and now knows how those voters participated in the election. It's just logical that they'll do a better job, unless they're just openly ignore what they've seen during the course of the campaign and the election. Now they actually know at least 50% of their voters desires and positions on policies. So, I mean, you have to do a better job with more information like that.
Somebody asks if somebody can speak about ranked choice voting at their church, and I think the answer is yes, for sure. And our campaign director is Brendan Finley. He's actually on this call. You can see his name floating around there. But anybody who would like to talk about having their community hear more about ranked choice voting, where the bill is, how they can get involved, et cetera, definitely reach out to Connecticut Voters First and remember Brendan Finley's name as kind of the organizer, but any of us could also address that.
And this Zoom was recorded, and you'll be able to find it on our YouTube and website, so you can also play this at your church as well. And if there's any more questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat. But I do know it's past 1 o'clock, so I will be ending this for everyone. I want to say thank you to our speakers and panelists for this. It was very informative. I learned so much on it. And yeah, and we'll be sending a follow-up email with all this. And like I said, please look out on our YouTube and website. We'll be having this recorded for everyone. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Everybody.
Thank you, Liliana.
Thank you.